The Vorthak Empire had been the kings of space for over 300 years. They didn't rule through love or respect. They ruled through fear. Pure, simple fear that made entire planets shake when their black ships appeared in the sky. Their method was brutal but effective. Find the weakest group in any system. Attack them without mercy. Make sure everyone else watches. The message was always the same. This is what happens when you don't obey us. On the small planet of New Terra, human families had built something beautiful. Minjay worked the farms with his children, growing crops that fed 3 neighboring colonies. His wife Sora taught the local children in a school they had built with their own hands. Their son Dongwu, only 8 years old, spent his days helping his father and playing with the other kids in the settlement. The humans had been careful to stay neutral in the Galactic Wars. They traded with everyone, fought with no one. Their little town of Peaceful Valley had exactly 412 people. They had no weapons bigger than hunting rifles, no ships except for cargo haulers that moved their crops to market. This was exactly what the Vorthak were looking for. Admiral Vexitar stood on the bridge of his massive warship, looking down at the green planet below. His red eyes glowed with satisfaction. The humans would make perfect examples. They were weak, isolated, and other species actually liked them. Destroying them would send the right message across the galaxy. "Sir, they're having some kind of celebration," reported his second officer. "Our scanners show the entire population gathered in the town center." "Perfect," Vextar smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "We attack during their moment of joy. The contrast will make our message even stronger." Down on New Terra, the harvest festival was in full swing. Children ran between colorful stalls selling fresh bread and sweet fruits. Dongwu laughed as he chased his friends through the crowd, his small hands sticky with candy. The adults shared stories and planned for the winter months ahead. The attack came without warning. Black ships dropped from the sky like falling meteors. Energy beams turned houses into burning ruins in seconds. People screamed and ran, but there was nowhere to hide. The Vorthak soldiers landed in the town square, their armor gleaming like polished metal. Minjay grabbed his son and wife, trying to reach the forest beyond the town, but the aliens were faster. Energy nets fell from the sky, trapping the running families like fish in a net. "Please," Sora begged as the soldiers forced them back to the town center. "We have no weapons, we're just farmers." The aliens didn't answer. They couldn't understand her words, but they didn't care what she was saying anyway. Admiral Vextar stepped down from his ship, walking slowly through the terrified crowd. His boots made clicking sounds on the stone ground. He stopped in front of Dongwu, who was holding tight to his mother's dress. "This child," the Admiral said in his strange, hissing voice. A translator device made his words clear to every human ear. "This small, innocent child will carry our message to the galaxy." "No," Minjay stepped forward. "Take me instead. He's just a boy." The Admiral pushed Minjay aside with one clawed hand. The man fell hard, blood running from a cut on his face. "The young ones make the best examples," Vextar explained to his soldiers, as if he was teaching a lesson. "When you kill the children, the parents never forget. When you kill the parents, the children sometimes grow up and forgive. But no parent ever forgives the murder of their child." Cameras floated through the air, recording everything. The execution would be broadcast live across 17 star systems. Every species would see what happened to those who didn't show proper respect to the Vorthak Empire. Little Dongwu looked up at the tall alien with confusion rather than fear. He didn't really understand what was happening. In his 8 years of life, no one had ever hurt him on purpose. "Why are you angry at us?" he asked in his small voice. "Did we do something wrong?" Admiral Vextar raised his weapon. The energy blade hummed with deadly power. "You existed," he said simply. "That was mistake enough." The blade fell. The cameras recorded everything. The message went out to the galaxy within minutes. What the Vorthak didn't know was that humans were different from other species. When others saw the broadcast, they turned away in horror and made plans to stay far from human space. But humans didn't turn away. They watched. They remembered. And they began to plan something that would make the Vorthak wish they had chosen any other species in the galaxy as their example. The harvest festival was over. Something much darker was about to begin. 3 weeks after the massacre on New Terra, The galaxy seemed strangely quiet. The usual politicians who loved to make angry speeches stayed silent. No emergency meetings were called. No warships moved toward Vorthak space. Even the news networks, which normally jumped on any story involving violence, barely mentioned what happened to the human settlement. Admiral Vextar sat in his command chair, reading reports from across the Empire. Everything looked normal. Trade continued. Planets paid their taxes. Other alien species went about their daily business as if nothing had happened. "I told you it would work," he said to his officers, his voice full of pride. "One public execution, and an entire species learns to behave. The humans have gone completely silent." His second-in-command nodded eagerly. "Sir, our intelligence reports show no military build-up in human space. No new weapons being produced, no ships being armed. They seem to have accepted their place in the galaxy." Back on the Vorthak homeworld, the High Command was equally pleased. General Zexkol, the Empire's military leader, stood before a room full of commanders, pointing at a star map. "The human territories show no signs of resistance," he announced. "No distress calls to other species asking for help. No attempts to form alliances. They understand that we are their masters now." But the Vorthak were looking at the wrong things. Far away on the mining station Asteroid Base 7, Engineer Hijin stared at her computer screen. The image that filled it was burned into her memory now. Little Dongwu's face, frozen in his last moment of confusion, before the alien blade fell. She had watched the recording 50 times, and each viewing made the fire in her chest burn hotter. Hyejin's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard. She wasn't sending military reports or calling for help from the government. Instead, she was doing something much simpler and much more dangerous. She was sharing. The image of Dongwu spread through the human networks like wildfire, not through official channels that the Vorthak might monitor, but through personal messages between friends, family communications, and private trade networks. A mother on Earth sent it to her sister on Mars. A teacher on the Jupiter colonies shared it with her former students scattered across the outer worlds. A merchant captain showed it to every human he met during his travels. Captain J1 of the cargo ship Star Wanderer received the image while loading supplies on a neutral trading station. He stared at the picture for a long time, his weathered hands shaking slightly. He had children of his own, safe on a human colony world. The thought of what had happened to this innocent boy made something cold and hard settle in his stomach. "Change our route," he told his crew. "We're not delivering to any Vorthak stations anymore." His navigator looked confused. "Sir, we'll lose half our income. The Vorthak pay better than anyone else." "I don't care," Jaywin said quietly. "Find us new customers. I don't want their blood money." Across human space, the same conversation was happening on hundreds of ships. Traders who had carried goods to Vorthak worlds for decades suddenly found new routes. Mining operations that sold rare metals to the Empire discovered they were too busy to fulfill orders. Research stations that had shared scientific data with Vorthak universities had computer problems that prevented any further communication. Dr. Sunwoo worked late into the night at his laboratory on the edge of human space. Officially, he was researching new farming techniques to help feed the growing colonies. But the real work happened after his assistants went home. In a locked room deep in the facility, he was designing something very different. "If they want to kill our children," he whispered to himself while working on his secret project, "they should understand what parents are capable of." The Vorthak intelligence network, which had kept the Empire safe for centuries, completely missed what was happening. They looked for the usual signs of military preparation. They watched for governments making angry statements. They monitored for fleet movements and weapon shipments. They didn't notice that human merchant ships had stopped arriving at their space stations. They didn't realize that spare parts for their machinery were becoming harder to find. They didn't understand that the scientific cooperation they had taken for granted was quietly disappearing. Most importantly, they didn't see the messages flowing through human space. Not calls for war or revenge, but something simpler and more powerful. Every human settlement, every ship, every family was sharing the same image and the same quiet promise. The Vorthak had killed little Dongwu to send a message. Now the humans were sending their own message back, not through words or threats, but through action. Every trade deal cancelled, every communication cut, every small act of defiance was building towards something bigger. The silence the Vorthak celebrated wasn't fear. It was the sound of an entire species holding its breath before striking back. They had taught the galaxy that violence against the innocent had consequences. Soon, they would learn that humans had been very good students. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when the Vorthak patrol ship, Death's Herald, missed its scheduled check-in. The vessel had been investigating what seemed like a routine distress beacon near the edge of human territory. Standard procedure for the Empire's forces. Always respond to distress calls, because sometimes you found easy targets. Admiral Vextar wasn't worried at first. Space was dangerous and ships sometimes had communication problems. But when 12 hours passed without any word, he sent the heavy cruiser Iron Resolve to investigate. The Iron Resolve never came back either. "Sir, we've lost contact with both ships," reported his communications officer, her voice tight with worry. The last transmission from Iron Resolve was them reporting they'd found debris from Death's Herald. Vextar felt the first cold touch of concern in his chest. 2 ships didn't just vanish. Not his ships, with their thick armor and powerful weapons. "Send a full search squadron. I want to know what happened." What they found 3 days later made no sense. The wreckage of both ships floated in the empty space between stars, twisted, metal glowing faintly in the light of distant suns. But these weren't the clean holes that military weapons made. The hull breaches looked like something had chewed through the armor from multiple directions. Commander Kexival, leading the search team, studied the wreckage through his ship's scanners. "Admiral, these impact patterns, they don't match any known weapon systems." "What do you mean?" Vextar demanded over the communication link. "The damage looks like it came from mining charges, sir, and industrial cutting lasers. But that's impossible. Civilian equipment can't penetrate military armor. But it could if you knew how to modify it, and humans, it turned out, were very good at modifying things. 6 months earlier, Yuna had been designing atmospheric processors for new colony worlds. She was good at her job, known for solving problems that other engineers couldn't handle. Her specialty was taking equipment meant for one purpose and making it do something completely different. When she saw the recording of little Dongwu's murder, something inside her broke. Then it rebuilt itself into something harder and sharper. "Can't fight them with military ships," she told the small group of humans gathered in the cargo bay of her engineering vessel. "We don't have warships or trained soldiers, but we have something else." She gestured to the equipment around them. Mining charges that could crack asteroids, industrial lasers that could cut through space station hulls, electromagnetic pulse, generators used for clearing debris from shipping lanes. "We have tools, and tools can become weapons if you're creative enough." Her team was an odd mix. Jae-hoon had been a mining foreman before the war started. Minji worked on the massive cargo haulers that moved goods between colonies. Seokmin was a demolition expert who cleared old buildings on settled worlds. None of them were soldiers, but they all had skills that the military didn't teach. "The Vorthak expect us to fight like other species," Yuna continued. "Big fleets meeting in open space, following the rules of war. But we're not going to follow their rules." Their ship, the Quiet Storm, looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a civilian cargo hauler moving supplies between human colonies. The Vorthak ships that scanned it saw standard cargo containers, basic life support systems, and a small crew of harmless merchants. They didn't see the mining charges hidden inside the cargo containers. They didn't notice that the industrial cutting lasers had been modified to fire in synchronized bursts. They couldn't detect the electromagnetic pulse generators that had been rebuilt into ship-killing weapons. When the Death's Herald responded to what seemed like a distress beacon, the crew probably thought they were about to capture some helpless human traders. Instead, they found themselves facing something new and terrifying. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. The Quiet Storm dropped its disguise, revealing weapon ports that opened like the petals of a deadly flower. Mining charges, designed to crack apart asteroids, punched through the patrol ship's armor like it was made of paper. Industrial lasers that could cut metal for 12 hours straight, sliced through vital systems with surgical precision. The Iron Resolve arrived to find debris and no survivors. They probably had just enough time to send a partial report before Yuna's team struck again. "For Dongwu," Yuna whispered as she fired the final salvo that sent the cruiser spinning into the darkness. Its hull split open like a broken toy. But Yuna's team wasn't alone. Across human space, other groups were preparing. Similar surprises. A mining crew on Asteroid Station 12 had turned their rock crushers into ship traps. A salvage team near the Jupiter colonies was using their hull-cutting equipment to slice apart any Vorthak vessel that came too close. The Empire had taught the galaxy a simple lesson: attack the weak to control the strong. But they had misunderstood something important about humans. When you attack their children, parents don't become weak with grief. They become dangerous beyond measure. Admiral Vextar stared at the reports coming in from across his territory. More ships missing, more wreckage found, more evidence of weapons. That shouldn't exist, being used by people who shouldn't know how to fight. The humans had been quiet for 3 weeks. Now he was beginning to understand that their silence hadn't been surrender. It had been preparation. The Vorthak military had fought wars for centuries, and they understood how wars worked. Armies gathered, fleets moved, governments declared intentions. There were rules, patterns, predictable strategies that could be countered with proper planning. What was happening with the humans broke every rule they knew. Admiral Vextar stood before his tactical display, watching red warning symbols spread across the star map like a disease. "Where is their command center?" he demanded. "Where are their generals giving orders?" His intelligence officer, Commander Zexnal, looked confused and frustrated. "Sir, we can't find one. There's no central command structure, no military headquarters, no chain of command that we can identify." "That's impossible," Vextar snarled. "Every species has a command structure. Someone has to be coordinating these attacks." But no one was coordinating anything, and that's exactly what made it so terrifying. On the remote mining station Deep Rock 7, mechanic Tai Hyun crawled through the maintenance tunnels with a toolkit and a plan. The station supposedly served both human and Vorthak mining operations, processing rare metals from the asteroid belt. The aliens had never suspected that the quiet human who fixed their equipment might have other talents. Tai Hyun had been repairing machines since he was 12 years old. He understood how things worked, which meant he also understood how to make them not work. Over the past month, he had been making tiny modifications to every piece of Vorthak equipment that came through his workshop. "Just small changes," he muttered to himself as he worked in the dark tunnel. "A loose connection here, a worn bearing. There, nothing that would be noticed during regular inspection." The beautiful thing about sabotage was that it didn't look like sabotage. When a Vorthak transport ship broke down 3 days into its journey, the crew assumed it was normal mechanical failure. When a supply convoy's navigation system started giving wrong coordinates, they blamed it on solar interference. When weapons systems on Vorthak patrol ships began misfiring at critical moments, the aliens thought they had quality control problems. They never suspected the quiet human mechanic who had serviced their equipment. Meanwhile, Trader Jiwon piloted her cargo ship Lucky Star through the busy shipping lanes between systems. Her ship's manifest listed her cargo as agricultural supplies and consumer goods, boring stuff that security forces rarely bothered to inspect closely. What they didn't know was that Jiwon had been a communications specialist in her younger days, before she became a trader. Her boring cargo included some very interesting listening devices. "Vorthak supply convoy leaving Kepler Station at 0600 tomorrow," she whispered into her private communicator. 3 heavy transports light escort, taking the inner system route to avoid the asteroid field. Her message went out on frequencies that the Vorthak couldn't monitor, using codes that changed daily. Within hours, that supply convoy would encounter what appeared to be a disabled human transport ship requesting assistance. The Good Samaritan instinct would kick in, and when the Vorthak ships moved to investigate, well, Yuna's people were getting very creative with their surprise attacks. In Nai, a basement laboratory on the colony world New Sol, scientist Naeon worked by the light of a single desk lamp. Officially, she was researching improved crop yields for the agricultural settlements. Her laboratory equipment was perfectly normal. Microscopes, chemical analyzers, protein synthesizers. But Nyan had a doctorate in biochemistry, and she remembered her lessons about how certain compounds affected different species. The Vorthak had a particular vulnerability to a class of chemicals that were harmless to humans. All it took was introducing these compounds into their air recycling systems, and for every child they killed, she whispered, as she carefully prepared another batch of her special formula, they'll pay with interest. The genius of the human response was that it looked completely random to outside observers. A Vorthak patrol ship would explode near a mining station, and investigators would find only innocent human workers expressing shock and offering to help with the cleanup. A supply convoy would vanish while passing through a system where human merchants reported nothing unusual. The aliens couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't target a command structure that didn't exist, couldn't negotiate with leaders who weren't giving orders. 12-year-old Minseo learned to load the improvised missile launcher her father had built in their family's machine shop. Her job was simple. When the warning light flashed, she pressed the red button. She didn't need to know about trajectory calculations or target acquisition. The computer handled all of that. Remember, her father Sang-hoon told her during practice, you're not a soldier. You're just helping Dad with his work. But she understood what the work really was. For every human child old enough to reach a control panel had become part of the war effort. Not because anyone ordered them to, but because their parents had explained what happened to little Dongwu, and children have a very clear sense of right and wrong. The space station Haven Point looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a neutral refueling stop for ships traveling between systems. The Vorthak had used it dozens of times without incident. The human staff was always polite and professional, providing fuel and supplies without asking awkward questions. They didn't notice the missile pods hidden inside the cargo containers that had been temporarily stored on the station's outer hull. They didn't realize that the helpful human technicians who serviced their ships had been planting tracking devices and listening bugs. When Admiral Vextar's personal flagship arrived at Haven Point for what should have been a routine supply stop, the station's disguise dropped like a mask. Hidden weapons emerged from concealment, and what had seemed like a safe harbor became a trap. The humans didn't capture the Admiral. They didn't demand surrender or negotiate terms. They simply eliminated the threat, then went back to their normal jobs as if nothing had happened. Sir, Commander Zexnel reported, his voice shaking, we've lost 17 systems in the past month, not to invasion fleets, but to invisible attacks. Our ships arrive at systems that should be secure, and they just disappear. Admiral Vextar stared at the tactical display, watching his empire dissolve like sugar in rain. How do you fight an enemy that's everywhere and nowhere? How do you defeat a species where every civilian is a potential weapon? The answer was simple, though he didn't want to admit it. You couldn't. The Vorthak had created an enemy unlike anything they'd ever faced before, an entire species that had decided their individual lives mattered less than removing the threat to their children. They had taught humans that violence was the language of power. Now the humans were speaking that language fluently, and they had a lot to say. The final battle for the Vorthak homeworld didn't look like the epic space battles that historians would later write about. There were no massive fleets facing each other across the void, no dramatic speeches broadcast across the galaxy. Instead, it looked like what it really was, the end of a nightmare that had gone on too long. Seok-jin strapped himself into the pilot's seat of his damaged fighter, knowing he wouldn't be coming home. The small ship had taken heavy fire during the approach to the planet, and half his systems were failing. Warning lights blinked red across his control panel, and the engine made grinding sounds that meant it was about to give up completely. Dad, your ship is falling apart, came his daughter's voice over the communication system. Pull back and let someone else take the shot. Minji was down on the planet's surface, coordinating the assault on the last Vorthak stronghold. At 26, she had become one of the most effective field commanders in the human forces. Not because anyone had trained her for war, but because she was very good at solving problems, and the Vorthak had become humanity's biggest problem. Sorry. Sweetheart, Seok-jin replied, checking his targeting systems one more time. But this is the only way to be sure. The Vorthak Command Center sat in the middle of their capital city like a black mountain of metal and hate. For 300 years, orders had flowed from that building to every corner of their empire. Orders to kill, to terrorize, to rule through. Fear. The building was heavily shielded, protected by energy barriers that could stop any conventional weapon. But Seokjin's fighter wasn't carrying conventional weapons anymore. The human engineers had been creative with their modifications. His ship was essentially a flying bomb, packed with enough explosive power to crack open a moon. "Tell Mom I love her," he said quietly, then pushed his throttle to maximum. The fighter screamed through the planet's atmosphere, trailing fire and debris. Vorthak defense systems tried to stop him, filling the sky with energy bolts and missiles. But there's something terrifying about an enemy who doesn't care if they die, as long as they complete their mission. The impact lit up the sky like a second sun. When the light faded, the command center was gone, replaced by a crater that glowed with molten metal. Down in the city streets, Minji watched the explosion through her helmet's display and felt tears running down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but of relief. After 18 months of war, after watching so many friends and family die, it was finally over. "All units, the command center is down," she announced over the communication network. "Vorthak forces are surrendering across the planet. We did it." But even as she spoke, she knew that winning wasn't really the right word. You don't win a fair war like this one. You just survive it and hope the cost wasn't too high. The Vorthak Empire died with their command center. Without central leadership, their forces across the galaxy simply stopped. Some surrendered. Others fled to the outer, rim territories. A few tried to fight on alone, but they were hunted down by human teams who had become very good at finding and eliminating threats. In the months that followed, other alien species watched the aftermath with a mixture of horror and fascination. The humans didn't celebrate their victory with parades or monuments. Instead, they quietly went back to their farms and factories and research stations, as if the war had been just another job that needed doing. But the galaxy had learned something important about these seemingly peaceful creatures. The Zelaxian Council, which represented 12 different alien species, held an emergency session to discuss what they had witnessed. Ambassador Keksavol, who had survived the destruction of the Vorthak Empire, stood before the assembled delegates with a warning. "The humans don't fight like other species," he said, his voice still shaking from what he had seen. "When you threaten host species, they organize their military and fight according to established rules. When you threaten humans, every single one of them becomes a weapon." The Council voted unanimously to remove all human territories from their expansion plans. Trade agreements were quickly signed. Diplomatic missions were established. Nobody wanted to risk becoming the next target of human grief turned into purpose. On Earth, in a small museum dedicated to the children lost in the war, a simple plaque bore the name Dongwu, along with 3,147 others. Visitors came from across the galaxy to read those names and understand what they represented. The plaque's inscription was written in 17 different languages, but the message was the same. These children died far from home, killed by those who thought fear was power. Their parents disagreed. Captain Jaewon, now retired from space travel, would sometimes visit the museum with his grandchildren. When they asked about the war, he would point to Dongwu's name and tell them the truth. "We're not warriors by nature," he would say. "We're builders, explorers, dreamers. But when someone hurts our children, we become something else entirely. Something that doesn't stop, doesn't compromise, and doesn't forgive until the threat is gone forever." The galaxy learned to leave humanity alone after that. Not because they feared human military power, but because they understood that humans were most dangerous when they were protecting something they loved. In the end, the Vorthak Empire had taught the galaxy an important lesson. If you rule through fear, eventually you'll meet someone who transforms fear into something far more powerful than any weapon. They had met their match in a species that turned grief into purpose and love into unstoppable determination.